The air in the Everglades at night is thick enough to choke you, heavy with the scent of rot and the low, constant hum of insects. I crouched in the mud, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, every muscle in my body screaming to run. But I didn't dare move. Not with those eyes watching me from the black water, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's trembling beam. I'd lost track of how long I'd been hiding, 10 minutes, an hour, maybe more. Time doesn't work the same way out here after dark. The rules say you never shine your light at the cypress knees after midnight, but I'd slipped, just for a second, and now something was out there, circling, waiting. I could hear it breathing, slow and wet, like the swamp itself had lungs. My radio crackled with static, but I didn't dare answer. The rules were clear: if you hear your own voice calling from the water, you don't respond. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to remember every line, every warning, every story the old rangers had whispered over campfires. I'd thought they were just trying to scare the new guy. But now, with the darkness pressing in and the water rippling with things I couldn't see, I understood. The rules weren't a joke. They were the only reason I was still alive. And tonight, I was dangerously close to breaking every single one. I arrived at the Everglades Ranger Station just as the sun was sinking behind a wall of sawgrass, the sky bleeding orange and purple over a landscape that looked more like another planet than anything I'd ever called home. The air was thick, humid, and alive with the sound of frogs and distant bird calls. My boots squelched in the mud as I stepped out of my truck, the tires already half swallowed by the soft ground. The station itself was a squat, weathered building perched on stilts, its paint peeling and windows fogged with the residue of 1,000 storms. A battered sign out front read, "Everglades National Park, South Gate," but the letters were faded, half-eaten by lichen. Inside, the air was cooler but no less oppressive. The walls were lined with maps, faded photographs, and a corkboard cluttered with missing person flyers. I could smell coffee, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. The only other person in the room was a man in his 50s, skin tanned to leather, eyes sharp and wary. He introduced himself as Ranger Dalton, the senior officer on night duty. His handshake was firm, but his gaze lingered a little too long, as if he was sizing me up for something more than just a job. After a brief tour, radio room, supply closet, the bunkhouse out back, Dalton handed me a laminated sheet. "You'll want to memorize these," he said, voice low. "They're not in the official handbook, but out here, they're the only thing that matters." I glanced down at the list. Rules for surviving the swamp after dark. There were 10 of them, each more bizarre than the last. Don't answer voices from the water. Never leave the boardwalk after midnight. If you see lights moving through the trees, turn away and count to 30. I looked up, half expecting a smirk, but Dalton's face was stone. "You follow these, you'll make it through your first week. Ignore them, and you'll end up like the others." He nodded toward the corkboard, where a dozen faces stared back at me, their smiles frozen in time. I tucked the rules into my pocket, the paper already damp with sweat. Outside, the sun had vanished, and the swamp was swallowing the last of the light. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. This place was beautiful, yes, but it was also hungry. And I was starting to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. Dalton wasn't the only ranger on night duty. After stowing my gear in the bunkhouse, I met the rest of the crew over a dinner of reheated chili and stale cornbread. There was Maria, a wiry woman in her early 40s with a sunburned nose and a laugh that came easy, even when her eyes didn't. She'd been working the Everglades for over a decade, and her arms were crisscrossed with old scars, snake bites, she said, though she never explained how she got so many. Maria was the one who told the best stories, her voice dropping to a whisper as she described things she'd seen in the fog, shapes that didn't belong to any animal she knew. Then there was Tyler, the new recruit, barely out of college and still clinging to the idea that the world made sense. He wore his skepticism like armor, rolling his eyes at Maria's tales and scoffing at Dalton's warnings. "It's just a swamp," he said, grinning at me as if we were in on the same joke. "Alligators, snakes, maybe a few lost tourists. The rest is just campfire nonsense." But I noticed he kept glancing at the list of rules Dalton had given us, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if he wanted to believe, but couldn't quite let himself. Among the locals, there was Old Man Harlan, who ran the bait shop by the boat launch. He'd lived in the Glades his whole life and claimed to know every inch of it. Harlan never set foot outside after dark, locking his doors and windows tight as soon as the sun dipped below the trees. "You kids think you're tough," he'd say, shaking his head. "But the swamp's got a memory. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." The relationships were uneasy, a mix of camaraderie and caution. Dalton watched over us like a hawk, Maria tried to make me feel welcome, and Tyler seemed determined to prove the rules were just superstition. I found myself caught between wanting to fit in and feeling the weight of every warning. The rules were a wedge, dividing belief from doubt, old scars from fresh bravado. As the night deepened and the swamp pressed in, I wondered which side I'd end up on, and whether it would matter when the darkness finally came for us all. After dinner, Dalton gathered us in the radio room, the only place where the generator's hum dulled the night's endless chorus. He closed the door, flicked off the harsh overhead light, and switched on a battered desk lamp that cast long shadows across the peeling maps and faded photos. Maria leaned back, arms folded, her eyes never leaving the window. Tyler slouched in his chair, a smirk on his lips, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. Dalton slid a laminated sheet to the center. "Read them out loud," he said, nodding at me. "It's not enough to know them. You have to hear yourself say them." I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of their attention. Rule 1, don't answer voices from the water, no matter who they sound like. Dalton's face was stone, but Maria's voice was soft. Last year, a ranger heard his brother calling from the bayou. He'd been dead for 5 years. He followed the voice. We never saw him again. I swallowed and moved on. Rule 2, never leave the boardwalk after midnight. Tyler snorted. What, the gators get bolder at midnight? Dalton didn't blink. The swamp changes after dark. Paths twist. Sometimes the ground isn't where you left it. Rule 3, if you see lights moving through the trees, turn away and count to 30. Maria's eyes flicked to the window. Will-o'-the-wisps, or worse. They want you to follow. Don't. Rule 4, if you hear your own name whispered in the wind, cover your ears and don't look around. Dalton's voice was low. It's never a friend. Rule 5, don't shine your flashlight at the cypress knees after midnight. Tyler rolled his eyes. What's a cypress knee going to do, trip me? Maria shook her head. Some things don't like to be seen. Shine your light, and you might see them. Or they might see you. Rule 6, if you find a trail of feathers, don't follow it. Turn back the way you came. Dalton's jaw tightened. Birds don't leave trails. Not in the glades. Rule 7, if you hear drumming in the distance, stay put until it stops. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. It's not a party. It's a warning. Rule 8, if you see a child alone in the swamp, do not approach. Do not speak. Walk away. Dalton's eyes were hard. There are no children out here after dark. Rule 9, if your watch stops working, head back to the station immediately. Don't wait. Don't ask questions. Tyler finally looked uneasy. What happens if you don't? Dalton didn't answer. Rule 10, at sunrise, thank the swamp for letting you leave. Every single morning. Maria nodded. It's just good manners. I finished, the words hanging heavy in the air. Tyler tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. That's some list. Dalton's gaze was steady. You don't have to believe. You just have to obey. The rules seemed ridiculous, but as the wind rattled the windows and the swamp pressed close, I felt a chill settle in my bones. Out here, the line between superstition and survival was thinner than I'd ever imagined. My first night shift started with a sense of restless anticipation. The station was quiet, the others either asleep or pretending to be. I sat alone in the radio room, the list of rules propped against the console, my eyes drifting to it every few minutes. Outside, the swamp was a black expanse, the boardwalk vanishing into the darkness like a path to nowhere. I told myself it was just another night, just another job, but the silence pressed in, thick and expectant. Around midnight, I stepped out onto the porch to check the weather instruments. The air was heavy, the only sound the distant croak of frogs and the occasional splash of something unseen. I scanned the boardwalk, flashlight in hand, careful not to let the beam stray too far. The rules echoed in my mind, especially the one about the cypress knees. I tried to laugh it off, but my grip tightened on the light. As I turned to go back inside, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on hollow wood. I froze, heart thudding. The sound was coming from the far end of the boardwalk, just beyond the reach of my light. I remembered Rule 7, if you hear drumming in the distance, stay put until it stops. My rational mind told me it was just a woodpecker or maybe a branch knocking in the wind, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. Curiosity gnawed at me. I took a step forward, then stopped. The tapping grew louder, closer, as if whatever was making it knew I was listening. My skin prickled with fear, but I forced myself to stay put, counting the seconds in my head. 30, 60, 90. The drumming continued, relentless, until suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I waited another minute before backing slowly into the station, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I set the flashlight down. I wanted to radio Dalton or Maria, to ask if this was normal, but I didn't want to sound like a coward on my first night. Instead, I sat in the dim light, staring at the rules, replaying the sound over and over in my mind. Doubt crept in. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the rules were just stories to keep us on edge. But as I lay in my bunk later, listening to the swamp breathe and shift outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me to break the rule. That it was still out there, patient, watching, and that tonight, I'd passed a test I hadn't even known I was taking. The next few nights blurred together, each one heavier than the last. The swamp seemed to grow denser after dark, the air thick with secrets. I started to notice things I'd missed before, the way the frogs fell silent all at once, the sudden chill that crept in even when the thermometer said it was 80 degrees, the feeling of being watched from the black water just beyond the boardwalk. The rules became a mantra in my mind, each one a lifeline I clung to as the darkness pressed closer. Tyler, on the other hand, grew restless. He joked about the rules, called them swamp fairy tales, and rolled his eyes whenever Dalton or Maria reminded us to be careful. One night, as we patrolled the boardwalk together, he stopped and pointed his flashlight at a cluster of cypress knees, grinning. "Bet nothing happens," he said, flicking the beam back and forth. I grabbed his arm, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't. Just, don't." He laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "You're starting to sound like them." That same night, Maria radioed in from the North Trail, her voice tight. "I'm seeing lights in the trees. Blue and white, moving fast. I'm turning away and counting." I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, as she counted out loud. When she reached 30, the lights vanished. She returned to the station pale and shaken, refusing to talk about what she'd seen. Dalton just nodded, as if this was routine. The tension in the group grew. Tyler's bravado started to crack. He confessed to me one night that he'd heard his mother's voice calling from the water, soft and pleading. "She died when I was a kid," he whispered, eyes wide. I almost answered. I almost stepped off the boardwalk. I didn't know what to say. The rules were no longer just words on a page, they were the only thing keeping us from slipping into something we couldn't understand. One evening, a storm rolled in, lightning flickering over the sawgrass and thunder shaking the windows. The power flickered, then died, plunging the station into darkness. Dalton handed out backup lanterns and told us to stay inside until the storm passed. But Tyler paced restlessly, peering out the windows. "I saw something," he muttered. "A kid, out by the boat launch." She looked lost. Maria's face went white. "There are no children out here after dark. You know the rule." But Tyler was already at the door, lantern in hand. What if she's real? What if she needs help? The FOMO was palpable, the fear of missing a chance to save someone, the terror of what might happen if we ignored a real person in trouble. I hesitated, torn between the rules and my own instincts. Dalton blocked the door, his voice like steel. "You go out there, you don't come back. That's not a child." That's something wearing a child's face. The storm raged outside, rain lashing the windows, the wind howling like a living thing. Tyler stood frozen, torn between doubt and fear, the rules and his conscience. At that moment, I understood how easy it would be to break a rule, not out of recklessness, but out of hope, or guilt, or simple human decency. The swamp preyed on those instincts, twisted them into traps. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, listening to the storm and the distant, echoing sound of a child's laughter drifting through the rain. No one slept. When dawn finally broke, the world outside looked unchanged, but something in our group had shifted. The rules were no longer just a list. They were a line in the mud, and we were all standing dangerously close to crossing it. It happened 3 nights after the storm, when the air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet rag. The station was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. Tyler hadn't been the same since the night of the storm. He was jumpy, shadows under his eyes, his jokes replaced by silence. Maria tried to draw him out, but he brushed her off, spending more time alone on the porch, staring into the darkness. That night, Dalton assigned me and Tyler to patrol the South Boardwalk together. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough to see by, and the lanterns cast long, trembling shadows across the planks. We walked in silence, the only sounds were our footsteps and the distant croak of bullfrogs. I kept my flashlight pointed at my feet, careful not to let the beam stray toward the cypress knees. Tyler lagged behind, dragging his boots, his shoulders hunched. Halfway down the boardwalk, we heard it, a faint, high-pitched voice, drifting over the water. "Tyler, help me," it was a child's voice, thin and desperate, echoing through the reeds. Tyler stopped dead, his face pale in the lantern light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Don't answer. Don't look. Just keep walking." But Tyler shook his head, his eyes wide and wet. "I can't. What if it's real this time?" Before I could stop him, he stepped off the boardwalk, boots sinking into the muck. "Tyler, no." I lunged for his arm, but he slipped from my grasp, stumbling toward the sound. The reeds closed around him, swallowing him whole. I froze, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at me to follow, to pull him back. But the rules, never leave the boardwalk after midnight, echoed in my mind. I called his name, but the only answer was the rustle of grass and the distant, mocking sound of a child's laughter. Then the swamp erupted. The water churned, black shapes twisting beneath the surface. The air filled with the stench of rot and something sharp, like ozone. I saw Tyler's lantern bobbing in the darkness, then a splash, a scream, high and thin, cut off mid-breath. The reeds thrashed violently, as if something massive was moving just out of sight. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the planks. My flashlight flickered, the beam catching a glimpse of something pale and long-limbed slithering through the water, eyes like wet marbles reflecting the light. I turned and ran, the boardwalk groaning under my feet, the sounds of pursuit close behind, splashes, guttural growls, the slap of something heavy against wood. I burst into the station, slamming the door behind me, chest heaving. Maria and Dalton looked up, faces tight with fear. "Where's Tyler?" Maria asked, voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. Dalton's jaw clenched. He broke the rule, didn't he? Outside, the swamp was alive with movement. Shadows flickered past the windows, and the air vibrated with a low, inhuman humming. Maria pressed her back to the wall, eyes wide. "We have to lock down. Now." Dalton moved quickly, securing the doors and windows, drawing the blinds. The station felt suddenly small, a fragile island in a sea of darkness. We huddled together, listening as the swamp raged outside. The child's voice returned, now joined by others, dozens, maybe hundreds, all calling, pleading, promising safety, forgiveness, a way home. The rules were all that stood between us and whatever waited in the dark. I clung to them, repeating each one in my mind like a prayer. The night stretched on, every minute an eternity. I thought of Tyler, of his doubt, his hope, his final, terrified scream. The guilt gnawed at me, but I knew the truth now, the rules weren't just superstition. They were the only thing keeping us alive. And tonight, we'd all learned what happened when you broke them. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The swamp outside looked unchanged, sunlight glinting off the water as if nothing had happened. But inside the station, everything was different. Tyler's bunk was empty, his boots still by the door, his jacket slung over the back of a chair. Maria sat at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of cold coffee, her hands trembling. Dalton moved through the rooms with a grim efficiency, checking locks, counting supplies, avoiding our eyes. No one spoke about what we'd heard in the night, the voices, the screams, the shadows pressing against the windows. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio or the distant call of a heron. I tried to convince myself that Tyler might have made it out, that he'd show up at the bait shop or stumble in from the trees, muddy and embarrassed. But deep down, I knew better. The swamp didn't give back what it took. Paranoia crept in, slow and suffocating. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Maria snapped at Dalton over nothing, her nerves frayed raw. Dalton snapped back, his patience worn thin. We blamed each other in small, bitter ways, who should have stopped Tyler, who should have done more, who should have known better. The rules, once a source of comfort, now felt like a curse, a set of impossible demands that none of us could fully trust. I started to question everything. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Was the thing in the water real, or just a trick of the light and fear? Was Tyler's scream a memory, or something the swamp had planted in my mind? I found myself replaying the night over and over, searching for a moment when I could have changed the outcome. Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake, listening to the swamp breathe, half expecting to hear Tyler's voice calling from the water. I wondered if I was losing my mind, if the rules were just a story we told ourselves to make sense of the senseless. But every time I looked at the empty bunk, at the faces on the corkboard, I remembered the truth: the swamp didn't care about our doubts. It only cared that we followed the rules, or paid the price. By the end of that day, we were 3 instead of 4, and the Everglades felt bigger, darker, and more dangerous than ever before. The days blurred together after Tyler disappeared, each one marked by a growing sense of dread. Maria barely spoke, her eyes hollow, and Dalton grew more rigid, his routines turning almost ritualistic. I clung to the rules, reading them every morning, whispering them like a prayer before each shift. But the swamp seemed to sense our weakness, pressing closer, testing the boundaries we'd drawn. It was just after midnight when the radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a voice, Maria's, but wrong, stretched and echoing, as if coming from underwater. "Help me," it pleaded, "I'm lost. I can't find the boardwalk." I froze, the rules screaming in my mind, "Don't answer voices from the water, no matter who they sound like." But the voice was so convincing, so desperate, and Maria was gone from her bunk, her boots missing from their usual place. Dalton burst into the radio room, his face pale and drawn. "She's not here," he said, voice shaking. "She went out to check the generator. I told her to wait until morning." The voice on the radio grew more frantic, sobbing now, begging for help. "Please, I can see the lights, but I can't get to you. I'm so cold." I looked at Dalton, searching for answers, but he just shook his head. "You know the rule. If you answer, it's over." "But if we do nothing," he didn't finish. The choice hung between us, heavy and impossible. I grabbed my flashlight and the rules, heart pounding. "I'm going after her," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Dalton grabbed my arm, his grip iron. "If you step off the boardwalk, you might not come back. You answer that voice, you might not be you when you do." His eyes were wild, desperate. "But if you go, take this." He pressed a small, battered compass into my hand. "It's old, but it's never failed me. Trust it, not your eyes." I stepped out into the night, the swamp swallowing me whole. The air was thick, the darkness absolute. I kept to the boardwalk, every step measured, the compass clutched tight. The voice called to me from the water, sometimes Maria, sometimes Tyler, sometimes my own mother. Each time, I bit my tongue, refusing to answer, refusing to look. Halfway down the boardwalk, I saw her, Maria, standing knee-deep in the water, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Don't come any closer," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." Behind her, the water rippled, something massive moving just beneath the surface. The rules screamed in my mind, "Never leave the boardwalk after midnight. Don't answer voices from the water." But Maria was real, I could see her breath, the fear in her eyes. "Throw me the rope," she said, voice cracking. "Please." I hesitated, torn between the rules and the desperate need to save her. FOMO gnawed at me, what if I did nothing? What if I lost her, too? I tied the rope to the railing and tossed the end toward her, careful not to step off the planks. She grabbed it, hands shaking, and I pulled, inch by inch, until she reached the edge of the boardwalk. As she climbed up, the water behind her exploded, something pale and many-limbed surging upward, jaws snapping inches from her boots. We scrambled back, hearts racing, as the thing slid back into the depths, the water closing over it with a sickening slurp. We collapsed on the planks, gasping for breath. Maria clung to me, sobbing, and I held her tight, the rules echoing in my mind. I'd bent them, skirted the edge, but I hadn't broken them. Not completely. The swamp had tested me, tempted me, but I'd survived, barely. As we made our way back to the station, Dalton met us at the door, relief and fear warring on his face. "You made it," he whispered, voice thick. I nodded, too shaken to speak. That night, I realized the rules weren't just about survival, they were about sacrifice, about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. And in the Everglades, sometimes the only way to live was to risk everything, and hope the swamp let you go. We barely had time to catch our breath before the swamp struck again. The air inside the station felt charged, every shadow stretched long and sharp by the flickering lanterns. Maria sat shivering, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the window. Dalton paced, muttering the rules under his breath, his hands trembling as he checked the locks for the third time. Then the humming started, a low, bone-deep vibration that rattled the glass and made my teeth ache. It grew louder, rising to a fever pitch, until the whole building seemed to pulse with it. Outside, the water boiled, reeds bending as if pressed by invisible hands. The lights in the trees returned, swirling blue and white, moving faster than before, circling the station like hungry wolves. Dalton grabbed his rifle, but I knew it wouldn't help. "Stay away from the windows," he barked, but it was too late. Shapes pressed against the glass, long-limbed, faceless, their bodies shifting and flickering like smoke. One of them slammed a hand against the pane, the impact spiderwebbing the glass. Maria whimpered, shrinking back, and I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. The rules had kept us safe, but now the swamp wanted to break them. The radio crackled, voices overlapping, pleading, threatening, promising anything if we just opened the door. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the words wormed their way in, each one a temptation. Dalton shouted, "Don't listen. Don't answer," but his voice sounded far away, drowned by the chorus outside. Suddenly, the back door rattled violently. The lock twisted, metal groaning. I lunged for it, bracing my body against the frame as something pounded from the other side. Maria screamed, Dalton fired a shot into the ceiling, the noise deafening in the small room. The pounding stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Then, a single voice, Tyler's, called from the darkness. "Let me in. Please. I'm cold. I'm scared." My heart twisted, every instinct screaming to help, but I remembered the rules, the faces on the corkboard, the thing I'd seen in the water. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I whispered. "You're not Tyler. You never were." The thing outside shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and the windows shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor. The lights surged, filling the room with blinding blue-white fire. I grabbed Maria and Dalton, dragging them to the center of the room, chanting the rules over and over, clinging to them like a lifeline. The storm of light and sound built to a crescendo, then broke all at once. The humming faded, the lights vanished, and the swamp fell silent. We sat in the wreckage, blood and sweat mingling on our skin, the rules still echoing in my mind. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Dalton let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half madness. Maria sobbed, clutching my hand. I stared at the ruined windows, the empty darkness beyond, and knew we'd survived, not because we were brave, but because we'd remembered what mattered most. In the Everglades, the rules were all that stood between us and the things that waited in the dark. And tonight, we'd hold the line. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the swamp in pale gold and softening the jagged edges of the night. The station was a mess, shattered glass, overturned chairs, muddy footprints leading from the door to the center of the room where we'd huddled together. The silence was different now, not heavy with threat, but hollow, as if the swamp itself was catching its breath. Dalton moved slowly, sweeping up glass and righting the furniture, his movements stiff but deliberate. Maria sat on the porch, wrapped in her blanket, staring out at the mist rising from the water. I joined her, the morning air cool against my skin, the world feeling both new and impossibly old. We didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what we'd survived. Instead, we watched the sun climb higher, listened to the birds return, and tried to believe that the worst was over. But the rules weighed on us, heavier than ever. I pulled the laminated sheet from my pocket, the edges worn soft from handling. I read each line again, searching for comfort, for certainty, for some sign that we'd done everything right. Dalton joined us, his face drawn but resolute. "We followed the rules," he said quietly, "and we're still here." Maria nodded, but her eyes were troubled. "Are the rules enough?" she asked. "Or did we just get lucky?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, as thick as the morning fog. I thought of Tyler, of the voices, of the things that pressed against the glass. I wondered if the rules were a shield or just a story we told ourselves to keep the darkness at bay. Maybe both. Maybe that was all anyone could hope for in a place like this. As the sun burned away the last of the mist, I stood and faced the swamp. "Thank you," I whispered, remembering the final rule. The water rippled, silent and watchful. I knew we'd survived, but I also knew the Everglades never really let you go. The rules had saved us, for now. But the swamp was patient, and the darkness would come again. A week later, the station felt almost normal again. Repairs were underway, and the routine of daily patrols returned, though none of us ever truly relaxed after sunset. The rules hung on the wall, a silent reminder, their edges curling from constant handling. Sometimes, I'd catch Maria tracing her finger down the list, lips moving as she recited each one under her breath. One morning, as I logged the night's events, a knock sounded at the door. A new ranger stood on the porch, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with the same mix of excitement and nerves I'd once felt. Dalton greeted him, handed over the laminated sheet, and watched as the newcomer read the rules, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Do I really have to believe all this?" the new ranger asked, glancing up. Dalton's gaze was steady. "You don't have to believe. You just have to follow them." That night, as darkness crept over the swamp, I lay awake listening to the wind whisper through the cypress. Somewhere out there, the water shifted, and a voice, familiar, impossible, called my name from the blackness. I pressed my hands over my ears, heart pounding, and waited for dawn. The rules had saved me once. But in the Everglades, the swamp never forgets, and it never forgives. I wondered how many more chances I'd get before it finally called me home.